Hello SGD, this will be a compilation of a few videos, a couple from one particular series, and then I'll be adding one onto that because they all do revolve around the same theme, but also a collection of interesting people. Now, foremost amongst those would be Athanasius Kircher, very influential, very important figure, very famous Jesuit, but he was a polymath. He published works on ancient history, especially on Egypt. He wrote the would translate, but essentially the encyclopedia of Egyptian history. With some interesting, were they actually reading hieroglyphs, at least to some level at that time? He was skilled in languages, but the main theme of this will be looking at Spagyric medicine or alchemy and the medicinal connections to those. Now, for instance, most Americans will call it a pharmacy. Here in Australia and in the UK would call it a chemist, as in chemistry or alchemy. And so the apothecary is the older name for it, and that was where you would go to buy all your ingredients and your medicines and that type of stuff from there. So I'll be looking at the Royal Society of Apothecaries in the City of London, the symbolism connected, links connected in there, but also how Kircher, who was a polymath. I'll put a link in a description to a series I called Science of the Symbols. The first 10 episodes look at his works, the geometry, metrology, connections, but also his connections with medicinal alchemy. And that would relate because the final piece will be on the Voynich Manuscript, and Kircher was one of those people who's was very interested and connected to the Voynich manuscript. So I'll link in the description to a long playlist, Science of the Symbols. Again, Kircher is prominent amongst those pieces, but this one will be on medicines, the apothecary, or the chemist slash pharmacy, Voynich manuscript, and Spagyric medicine or alchemy in those connections. So I hope you enjoyed. Have a good one. Hello SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded. This will be part 9 in this series, looking at the Corpus Hermeticum, Hermes Trismegistus, and the connections to these features. So the last one I just went briefly through some classical alchemical imagery, which includes the alchemy of metals, but also of chemicals and acids, that type of stuff. That's in the last series, but this one I wanted to look at alchemia or alchemy as it relates more to medicine. So again, we've been looking at Hermes Trismegistus or Hermes Mercurius Trismegistus, these origins, and the medieval period, the Renaissance, where most of this imagery comes from. But in earlier episodes went into these older books which basically speak of Hermes Mercurius Trismegistus as a pen name for scientists in general, and I want to explore that more in future episodes, but just laying some groundwork now for in regards to the alchemy of medicines and how that relates again to some interesting ancient texts, and I'll do that in future episodes, but just laying down the groundwork. Hermes Mercurius Trismegistus, Hermes in Greek, Mercury in Rome, god of science, commerce, weights and measures, botany, magic, medicine, and all these just general science in general, very much related to Thoth and Shesset, gods of writing. So Ian Blicker says in his opening chapter, Hermes, the god who presides over language. Thoth taught writing to humanity. Shesset invented writing. Gods of weights, measures, math, geometry, botany, medicine in ancient Egypt. The famous architect Imhotep, said to have invented pyramids. He was elevated into the equivalent of Thoth, a god, but he was also very famous for being a healer. Thoth, Shesset, gods of botany, medicine. The Corpus Hermeticum, or the Hermetica, includes tracts that to Asclepius, a letter to Asclepius, and of Asclepius to the king. Asclepius, the Greek god of healing. So, for instance, a medical faculty building here in Sydney University. Rod of Asclepius, a single rod with a snake wound about it. Now, more technically, I should have said the Greek god of medicine, because Apollo is technically the Greek god of healing. Asclepius is the patron god, patron or the god of healing, of doctors and medicines. More botany and medicine would be the more appropriate term. British Medical Association, we see this rod of Asclepius symbolism all over it. You'll find it in paramedics, etc. So this what's called the Star of Life pattern. At paramedics and pharmacists will have this symbol. The rod of Asclepius is one snake. The caduceus wand, magic rod, measuring rod of Mercury, or 1R, Hermes Mercurius Trismegistus, is also used by paramedics and doctors, and the caduceus, the two snakes, is in general a term related to science, especially the medical sciences, guides of knowledge, etc. The World Health Organization has the rod of Asclepius connected to them. Very, very common symbol, but this symbol with the rod of Asclepius around the cup, well, that's the cup of Hygeia, where we get the word hygiene. She was the daughter and one of the Asclepiads, which was like either a family or an ancient Greek guild of doctors and medicines. So the cup of Hygeia, even see her with the snake, and the rod of Asclepius. This is a pharmacy symbol, or a chemist, or a dispensary, or an apothecary. So tends to be in America. You have a pharmacy where you have that famous RX image. Now the mortar and pestle being a symbol there. So just like with apothecary, where we see the same tool. Here in Australia, and I believe it's in England, they tend to refer to this as a chemist. But a dispensary is another term used for those who give out medicine. So different from a doctor, the doctor gives you a prescription. The pharmacist or the chemist or the dispensary or the apothecary gives out the medicine. So, well, chemist, chemistry, well, alchemist. That's basically where it comes from. Famous image of alchemist, alchemia, the older term, alchemia. Shriners, it's related to the Masonic order, the ancient Arabic order of the nobles of a mystic shrine. They're those guys with the fez who usually drive around in the little cars, and a lot of hospitals and stuff that they do. Well, that's amongst the Shriners is alchemia. Oswald Croll, Basilica Chimica. Now there's a few interesting things going on there. So for instance, we have Paracelsus down here in the bottom corner. We have Geber, and we have Hermes Trismegistus. Also Anima, Spiritus, and Corpus, which mercury, sulfur, and salt. We'll come to that in a moment. I've mentioned it in the last episode. So Geber is shown here on this work by Croll. Geber or Jabir ibn Hayam, very famous alchemist, Arabic, suspected that many of the books attributed to him are actually written by other people, and that his was a pen name, just very much like Hermes Mercurius Trismegistus, as Ian Blicker says, back in the early 4th century, was a name attributed to everyone who wrote about science would put Hermes on the page. But Geber, Kibat Alchemia, that's essentially where the word alchemia, about the late 8th century, this was posted. Now that relates to, for instance, words like algebra or algorithm, actually emerged from the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, and there's a few other connections. So even elixir comes from al-exa. But alembic, which is used in distillation, the Arab word for it is alembic. Alembic. But it's suspected, so a lot of these Arabic words used in chemistry will actually have very similar words in Greek, for instance, because Greek was the ancient language of science. Ambics in Greek means cup or beaker. This is an image related to Zosimus, a very famous alchemist as well. Now, alchemy or alchemia, in Greek, chemia was the art of melting metals and making alloys. So the origin of alchemy, or this word, is a little bit muddled, but we also have alchemist is one of the explanations offered. And for instance, Egypt was known as the land of the black soil, or Kemet, and the black arts, as is often connected to this, would relate to that as well. Not as popular, but there is, if in Kimya or Hebrew, that translates to the divine science. So the origin of this word is a little bit muddled, but there are some of the connections. Now also elixir in Persian, well, there are other connections to that. I'll drop some links in the description in relation to those, but chemica, chemistry, alchemia, alchemy. Alchemists, I've been focusing on this, mentioned last one, but metals and alloys, compounds and mixtures such as acids and gunpowders, as well as making copper, iron, and all of these, which would be magic to a person who does not have that technology to be able to do these things. So that's why magic is often connected to this. But there's also an important, apothecary is the alchemy of medicine. So this is a Bocca museum to the apothecaries, or the alchemists of medicine. And another common alchemical symbol is the crocodile or the lizard. So apothecary from apotheke, repository or storehouse in Greek, apotheca, same thing in Roman. And so the apothecary, or the pharmacist, like he would have shelves and shelves of all the herbs, medicines, metals, which would also be used in basically all the chemicals and botanical herbs as well used for medicine would be stored there. The apothecary cabinet is those cupboards that have all those tiny little drawers, which were sort of popular a few years back as furniture. But that's what the apothecary is. It's medicine. Now, one of the most famous alchemists, especially connected to medicine, was Paracelsus. He's mentioned in all of these works, held very high regard. Basically the father of toxicology, they call him. Is many sayings. So, for instance, poison is in everything, and no thing is without poison. The dosage makes it either a poison or a remedy. So, at least in recorded, he was the first one basically say, yeah, there is no poison, it's just the dosage that counts. Medicine rests upon four pillars: philosophy, astronomy, alchemy, and ethics. He also said, this is alchemy, and this is the office of Vulcan. He is the apothecary and chemist of the medicine. Or Vulcan, or Hephaestus, was also the god of metalworking in ancient Greek and Roman. Last episode I went through some of this imagery and how these constellations they're using alchemical symbols, which relate to saltpeter, to purify. So these symbols are not just the actual substance, but also operations. But for instance, sulfur, and sulfur, along with mercury and salt, it makes up the three Paracelsian principles. However, this is an image attributed to Vasil Valentine from the Azoph of the Philosopher's Stone. And you might notice again sun and moon and the mercury there at the top, those seven metals, but also this triangle underneath where we have sulfur, salt, and mercury. Sulfur, mercury, and salt. Now, in this image by Oswald Croll again, we see Paracelsus at the bottom, and I've zoomed in on this triangle where we have Kabbalah, Theologica, Magia, Astronomy, Alchemy, Medica, but it also has a symbol of mercury, sulfur, and salt, which is also called Corpus Anima Spiritus. This is another way that it's referred to sometimes in the imagery with the symbols of those substances, but also Corpus Anima Spiritus. Professor Michael Foster, for instance, in this particular speech, he was talking about Vasil Valentine and his contributions to chemistry, which include hydrochloric acid, which he prepared from the oil and vitriol of salt. Basically, you would pour sulfuric acid onto salt, and there you extract hydrochloric acid. He began replacing the old idea of the ancients of the four elements: earth, air, fire, and water. Every element, chemical substance would be related to one of these, and Vasil Valentine really he or someone of in that generic area, sulfur, salt, sulfur, mercury, and salt. So sulfur of that which is combustible, which is changed or destroyed, or which at all events disappears during burning or combustion. So if you're like a matches sulfur, once it burns, it's gone. Now we have the periodic table, which by Mendeleev, which was probably one of the best discoveries in mankind. Also because it was such a brilliant theory, because it predicted elements that did not exist. That's why I was saying. But sulfur, salt, and mercury is an earlier version of this. So mercury temporarily disappears during burning or combustion. You can melt mercury from liquid. You can boil it and turn it into a vapor, and then you can return from the vapor. You can bring it back. As where salt, which is fixed, the residue of ash which remains after burning. So again, you basically need a nuclear reactor or something very, 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 very hot to melt salt. Paracelsus was also a promoter of a concept of macrocosm and microcosm, and he was a Hermeticist in that sense, and that's an idea where nature of a macrocosm, everything larger than man, reflects everything of human size and smaller, as above, so below. He relates it to medicines and chemistry, but you'll also find it in buildings and street plans. So if you haven't seen the series Secrets in Plain Sight by Scott Onstad, or I've gone through across America, Australia, Canada, and how the street plans designs reflect this principle, and up till a very modern era. This is surprisingly modern. It's still actually happening now in places like Astana. Tobias Schultz shows the next one as well. Okay, I'm going to have to nearly hitting the 15-minute mark. But again, I'm just going to follow on in the next one and look again at apothecary, pharmacy, chemistry, and alchemistry, and to these particular symbols. So I'll do the video straight after this and post it very, very soon. Cheers, have a good one, and as always, there's more to come. Hello, SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded. This will be part 10 of a series. You can find the playlist to the full series in the description, basically looking at Hermes Trismegistus, the Corpus Hermetica, and trying to find the oldest origins of those, what they mean, where they come from, etc. Talking about which is strongly connected to alchemy or chemistry, which includes metallurgy, alchemia, these Hermetic era, when Hermeticism in medieval period, Renaissance, etc. Hermes Mercurius Trismegistus, as in Siena Cathedral. Hermes Mercury, gods of science, commerce, weights and measures, knowledge, science, commerce, trade, navigation, the sciences. Hermes Trismegistus, often said to be Thoth and Sheshet, ancient Egyptian gods of writing. Hermes, a god who presides over language. 3rd century Iamblichus on the mysteries of the Egyptians, etc. Gods of astronomy, math, geometry, botany, and medicine. Imhotep, famous Egyptian architect, but also famous for being a healer. Later was elevated into like the embodiment of Thoth, but he was botany and medicine, being connected to these gods. Corpus Hermetica includes 3 tracts to Asclepius. Asclepius, the Greek god of healing. Still used in one of the symbols of medicine today. For instance, the rod of Asclepius, a snake coiled about the rod. It's also the Ophiuchus, the serpent bearer constellation, the only constellation which is a single constellation with 2 parts. That's Asclepius as well, the serpent bearer. So the rod of Asclepius, but also the rod wand of Hermes Mercurius, the caduceus, with 2 snakes, both used in medicine, especially World Health Organization rod of Asclepius. Very common symbol for apothecary or for pharmacy is the cup of Hygeia, with the rod of Asclepius connected to that. And this is about pharmacy, apothecary, chemist, or dispensaries, and the alchemy of medicine. Alchemist, still used there. Alchemia, we went through this, so just I'll jump through these, where the origins of words such as alchemy, the tools of alchemy such as an alembic for distillation, these various terms, how it sort of seems to connect through many different languages. But so alchemists as metal workers are making acids, etc. But notice even the scales. Okay, apothecary is the name of a dispensary or a pharmacy or chemist as well, and that's sort of a thing I'm looking at now. Say we left off at Paracelsus, very famous for as an alchemist, but especially for his work on medicines and the chemistry involved in medicines. Salt, sulfur, salt and mercury, and that was all in the last episode. So where I left off was macrocosm and microcosm. These very famous images, for instance, and the microcosm, man, everything which is smaller, well, at 5 points. So in geometry, it's often described as a pentagon and a hexagon. For macrocosm, nature, everything larger than man is the hexagon of 6 points, as in the Star of David, for instance. And microcosm is man and everything smaller, and the 5 points. But the philosophy regarding macrocosm and microcosm, this Hermetic idea, was one which was very strongly advocated by the famous physician, chemist, pharmacist Paracelsus, who also spoke on the importance of interpreting dreams and how astronomy connects with the medicines. And this will be something I'll examine in the future, because, for instance, the ancient Babylonian root diggers or herb collectors would have certain rituals, but also would pick herbs at a certain time of year based on movements of sun, earth, moon, and stars. But as above, so below, microcosm and macrocosm. This is the Harmonia Macrocosmicum Microcosmi, 1654, Tobias Schultz. You see the macrocosm and the microcosm, and Hermes Trismegistus is there. Now I mentioned salt, sulfur, and mercury. There we see mercury, salt, and sulfur. Again, very important in this, these schools. This is Integra Natura by very important alchemists, musician, theorists, Robert Fludd. And so this was a later image. We can see the earlier image. It's just been reversed. But there's also, notice that essentially the god or the divine holds the woman on a chain, and then the woman holds the monkey on the chain, and the monkey is actually holding a compass measuring the globe. But to focus, Athanasius Kircher, I've been mentioning him, done plenty of older videos on him. He's basically his encyclopedia on Egyptian history. He has this image of Isis with the sistrum. She also holds that's often called the handbag, but the pail, which relates to fertility in agriculture and irrigation in agriculture. Where are we? P. Fecundus terrain. So fecundus, fertility, prosperity, more fertility in the land of irrigation. Now, how this relates to this image is Isis often depicted with the breast milk, very similar to the earliest imagery of Mary feeding Jesus with the milk spurting from her breast. But there's another important connection here, because if we zoom in on their feet, notice Robert Fludd, we see 1 foot on land, 1 foot in the water. Isis or Minerva, Venus, so 1 foot on the land, 1 foot on the water as well. So this relating to agriculture as well, which would be a botanical thing in itself. But yeah, these Jesuits, just full of pagan ancient symbolism. So we come back to this comparison. This is the earlier work, and if we zoom in on it more closely, here's the full work. Robert Fludd did this image. Now there's a lot going on in these smaller pieces, but Robert Fludd, notice his hand. I'll put a link into a playlist in the description, History of a Hermetic, where I go through Robert Fludd and some others. Now what's cool is, okay, we zoom in. Now notice the monkey on the chain, which represents the overcoming your bestial nature and being more reasoned. Compass measuring the globe. But we also have distillation. We have alembics there, as I meant, the alembic, and we also have medicina. Also geometry, music, arithmetic, and astronomy. So we have the quadrivium of the 7 liberal arts, but also have the trivium in there as well. There's quite a bit going on in that imagery. But to stay, again, these alchemical symbols where we see the alembic again, the distillation process of alchemy and its relation to medicina or medicines, which is a sort of a topic for the moment. Now, Robert Fludd, notice his hand image. I did a video on other, but another famous esoterician, especially in regards to geometry, very mysterious, very important figure, was Albrecht Durer. Notice the positioning of his hands as well. People engaged in commerce, money, now the scales and all these imagery in the background, including, well, notice this is a very unnatural position of the hands, but what happens is that Heinrich Kunrath, some work on the Emerald Tablet, very important physician, very important alchemist. Notice the position of his hands once again. If you're posing for a picture, and these are all, if it was all the one artist doing this, okay, but we see this throughout time, different ones. This is kings and princes. Notice they're doing it all again. It's Christopher Columbus painting of Christopher Columbus. Well, yes. So this is like the original Hermeticists and these occultists, early ones. They're the original gangsters, you know, and it's gang signs. Okay, back to apothecary or dispensary or pharmacy with these emblems and symbols. Apothecary, there is a system of weight called the apothecary's weight. Hermes, Mercury, Thoth, Shesset, gods of weights, measure, science, etc. Notice even distillation processes in the apothecaries or the alchemists of medicine lab. It's not just about herbs, it's also about metals and copper sulfate and other compounds, chemicals in general. Temple of Antonius Pius and Faustina was converted into a church. Pope Martin V granted jurisdiction of this to the University of Apothecaries in Rome. One of the oldest pharmacy buildings is Santa Maria Novella, and so this, you know, like the old-fashioned, like, you know, in America we used to have the drugstore, you know, where you would go to get your milkshakes and other things. But that's a pharmacist, chemist, apothecary. Of the livery guilds in the city of London, you have all of these, would loosely be termed secret societies. The livery guilds are trade guilds, which includes spectacle makers, the oculists as they're called, the bakers guild, the bow and arrow making guild. But the apothecaries guild, these are the guild related to pharmacy and medicine. Here's an old picture, so the scales, but also this was where, you know, pharmacy was produced. They also used to control, or still do, the Chelsea, or the Physic Garden, now the Chelsea Public Garden, where they grew the plants used in making medicines and herbs. The official term for the Apothecaries Guild is the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries, like with all these other sort of organisations. Opened to the public in 1983, so just over 300 years. This was a closed shop, secret place in the city heart of London. Worshipful Society of Apothecaries. They were established in 1617, where they got their royal charter. Prior to that, they were part of a guild, the grocers, pepperers, spicers, and apothecaries. Prior to that, the spicers apothecary guild hall society. And that's been around since the 12th century. Now that's an important feature because grocers, pepperers, spicers, people selling fruit, spice, vegetables, etc., they work by a scale of measurement called the avoirdupois system. 1 pound is just over 0.45 kilograms. That's made up, each pound is of 16 ounces. Each ounce is 28.34. If you've ever bought a plant material, you might get where I'm getting at. They're sold by an ounce of 28.3 grams, or just a touch over. The Apothecary Guild separated from the Grocers and Spicers Guild, and they moved to the apothecary weight system. So instead of 1 pound being so 1 pound is 12 ounces. The apothecary 12 ounce is a pound. But because the ounce is 31.1 grams instead of 28.3, 12 ounce pound actually, it weighs 0.373 kilos as where a pound of tomatoes or potatoes is 0.54. There are different systems for different trades. Now that's key because the Troy system, when you see the price of gold mentioned on the newspapers, TV, etc., they measure it in the Troy system. And the Troy ounce is 31.1 grams, 12 ounces per pound, so 0.3732 kilograms. That's one Apothecaries ounce is exactly the same weight, and 1 pound is exactly the same. The smaller groupings of them, the parts that make up an ounce are different, but the pound and the ounce are the same. Medicines, apothecary, metals, that's the alchemist's measure. 1 alchemist pound is 373.24 grams, with each ounce being 31.104 grams. So the apothecaries moved away from the grocers, and they become and they adopted the apothecary weight, therefore connecting to the alchemist's weight of metals. Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes Mercurius Trismegistus, gods of knowledge, weights and measures, the Apothecaries Society, and I'll link because in 1617 when the Apothecary Worshipful Society of Apothecaries got their royal warrant, it was given to them by King James I, as in the King James Bible, which is also a very important period in the development of science, navigation, and weights and measure system. Prior to that, we had Queen Elizabeth I, and so I'll link that episode and that in the description as well. I'm nearly just over 14 minutes, so in this part, actually I'll stitch them together because now we look at the emblems of the Worshipful Society of the Apothecaries Guild. So you see it in stained glass, we see it above Apothecary Hall. This is at Chelsea, or the Physic Garden, and this is just an illustration of that. Okay, I'll do that next. Here we see the coat of arms of the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries, one of the livery guilds in the city of London. And what we actually have is this fellow here is Apollo. So he even has the golden bow and the golden arrow. He is the god of the sun. Artemis, his sister, has a silver bow and a silver arrow. Apollo is also famous for the lyre. Also, you might notice the constellation Corvus there in the cup of water. That has to do with this legend and the connection to these constellations, such as the constellation Corvus, Hydra, and Crater. But anyway, Apollo also connected to music. Now the Latin phrase underneath, throughout the world they speak of me as a bringer of help. That is what Apollo said according to Ovid in Metamorphosis Book 1, after Apollo had killed a snake or a python, serpent, depending on the usually it's a python, the interpretation of that, but still just in general terms a snake. And so the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries, this represents Apollo overcoming disease, because Apollo is also the god of healing as well as the bringer of plagues. For instance, the Delian problem, which is a math issue about doubling the volume of a cube, which is where you need to find the cubed root of 2. That relates to the Delian plague, where Apollo sent a plague upon the people of Athens. Now it's just curious that along with the 3-4 Pythagorean theorem, the Delian problem is also embedded inside the Great Pyramid. I'll put a link to that in the description, how a lot of this later, the quadrivium and all these elements coming together. But Apollo, god of healing, bringer of plagues. The lyre of Apollo was a gift from his brother Hermes, who in return gave Hermes a wand or a rod, measuring rod, it's the same thing in Greek, is of an oak branch to extend, of an olive branch. It's even where the term to extend an olive branch originates from. And so the caduceus, the wand, was from Hermes. Later on, Hermes saw 2 snakes fighting, and he separated them, and that's why the caduceus has the 2 snakes going together. But Apollo, Hermes, Hermeticism, Apothecaries Guild and alchemy connections, medicine. Now it just so happens that Asclepius, the god of medicine and doctors, is the son of Apollo. Asclepius, by getting the blood of Medusa, was able to bring people back to life. The thunderbolt of Zeus killed him because of that, and he became the Ophiuchus, the constellation, the serpent bearer. But these connections between medicine, knowledge, and Greek gods, and how during the Hermetic period, all the alchemists, Hermeticists, were all using Greco-Roman imagery in and the legends connected to these. This was at a time when Christianity had been well established, but all these societies were using much older imagery based on ancient texts, embedding this Hermetic tradition. So Asclepius, healing of medicine, god of Apollo, his father, god of healing. That's why we have the rod of Asclepius as a symbol of medicine or science, but also the caduceus of Hermes. These are all linked to Apollo essentially, because Hermes is Apollo's brother, Asclepius is Apollo's son. Which brings us back to the Corpus Hermetica, where this is one of the images of Hermes Trismegistus. In the Corpus Hermetica, it includes 3 tracks related to Asclepius, even named such. Now that's curious because, well, what is Apollo sitting on? He's sitting on the wyvern. So here's another one of the older images, Hermes, the wyvern, eating the snake as the snake eats the wyvern. Or it could be interpreted that the wyvern is spitting out the snake as the snake is spitting out the wyvern. Now it's often said the Ouroboros is the snake eating its tail. Maybe, but it's also, I think it's an important thing to consider that maybe it's just like with the Egyptian creation myth at the Ennead, where the serpent spat out the first of the gods after creation. So that's another way to look at it, possibly. It's also nice that this image has the compass and square, as well as these the symbols of the metals and the gods of alchemy, for instance. Mercury, silver or the moon, Venus or copper, Mars or iron, as well as the sun, and as well as Jupiter and Saturn, lead and tin or antimony, depending. But this image of Hermes, again with the wyvern eating the snake, or spitting it out alternatively, and there we see Apollo with the sun rays, so sun god Apollo, the golden arrow, the golden arrow and the bow, overcoming disease, as in Ovid's Metamorphosis, sitting on the wyvern. So these connections, Asclepius, Hermes, alchemy, medicine, these just pagan symbols still being so important and used centuries and centuries after, like, Christianity had an absolute monopoly, so it wasn't. But yeah, these symbols again, sun and moon, they're just a constant in there, and they have multiple aspects, because just like alchemy, it's more than making acids and compounds or metals. It's also related to apothecary, as we see in the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries in the City of London. I made these recent videos because I want to lead into where the origins, pre-Greco-Roman, now clearly from Egypt, but also from Babylon, and also the issue of translations and fanciful words. Okay, Apothecaries Hall, and that we also have the image. So above there, what we have is a rhino, and it seems that the rhino is trampling out a snake. Now that brings us back to Albrecht Durer, Robert Fludd. Okay, we mentioned earlier, doing those OG Hermeticists. This is a famous image of Albrecht Durer. You can even see the A and the D, and quite possibly, so when the first rhinos come, and these early drawings look a bit way off, but that's because they had to rely mainly on skins and carcasses rather than a healthy example. But again, another possible connection, because Albrecht Durer is just in one of those 6 degree of separation things, where you'll see again this very small clique of people who were publishing, doing a lot of scientific work, for instance, even in artistry on perspective, but the geometry of Albrecht Durer, all these other connections. So it's forms a nice little circle all these things, the sort of deeper you look, you'll always come back to the same people, same symbols, same emblems, development of science and logic, trivium and quadrivium, the 7 liberal arts, and all these things are sort of, again, hidden in plain sight. SGD, thanks for watching, and still a few more episodes in this series, and just looking at the origins and the oldest texts, and not the Corpus Hermeticum of the, tracing back from not just Egypt but also into Mesopotamia and Babylon and the medicine of Babylon and how that was so important. In the next one I'll also be linking it to the Voynich Manuscript because there are some nice connections in regards to all of that. So cheers, thanks for watching, have a good one. Links in the description. Hello, I'm going to post a short portion of this fantastic lecture by Erika Reiner, Hallowed Herbs, back in 1988. The audio is not the best, I've tried to fix it as best I can. The lecture will be on ancient magic, especially how it's connected to medicine and especially to herbs. For instance, the castor oil plant. You've probably heard of castor oil. In this lecture she'll talk about how words and phrases of these ancient alchemists, apothecaries, medicine people, root diggers, would use colourful language to describe their words, and that these translations, for instance the terminology for certain plants, have a very fantastic name, and this leads to, back in ancient times, the priests of the temple had to go out of their way to explain to the people that these fantastic terms are not literal. So for instance, Eye of Newt did not necessarily mean Eye of Newt. Now that's not a term she's going to use, but I'm just saying when it comes to Hollywood and stuff we hear these terms, but there is double meaning behind these. She'll also discuss the importance of astronomy and astrology, in that herbs had to be picked at a certain time and usually involved some sort of ritual connected to them. I'll also be showing images of certain plants, and they will link to the Voynich Manuscript, because the larger portion of a Voynich Manuscript is to do with herbs and plants. There's also apothecary jars and astronomy, which would relate to when a certain plant would be picked. This would also connect to the Greek magical papyri, which were found in Egypt, and these very old hermetic documents, which the alchemy includes medicine and other features, and also because of the importance of keeping it secret, keeping it safe, and how these terms were to keep trade secrets. And because the terms become popular, lion's fat, for instance, or the sperm of Hermes, the translation is actually to a simple herb. Anyway, hope you enjoy this as just a small portion.
It is good for scorpion sting. Its mode of preparation: to dry, to crush, to give to drink in beer. Obviously, these descriptions are very much like those found in the spells collected in the Hellenistic magical papyri, written in Greek or in Demotic. For example, the Canthritis plant grows from the months of Pliny onward in the regions of the Black Earth, that is Egypt, and is similar to the erect verbena. This is how to recognize it. If an ibis wing is dipped at its black tip and smeared with the juice, the feathers fall off when touched. Its stem is single and reddish down to the root, and the leaves are rather crinkled and have fruit like the tip of wild asparagus. It is similar to the so-called talates, like the wild beet. This very Canthritis is best picked, as the same papyrus recommends, at the night of the new moon, when the sun is in Leo. And from a Demotic magical papyrus in Jan Johnson's translation, the ivy, it grows in gardens. Its leaf is like the leaf of a Shechem plant, being divided into 3 lobes like a grape leaf. It is 1 palm in measurement. Its blossom is like silver. Another manuscript says gold. While many plant names, among them the ones I have quoted, are untranslatable, others, like the dog's tongue I've also mentioned, are meaningful but outlandish. Yet the ox blood, human skull, or lion's blood appearing in Babylonian texts are really no stranger than the humble herbs, wild lettuce, poke, and lamb's quarters that the root diggers gather today. And how about foxglove or snapdragon? It is again the Hellenistic propriety that provides us with a clue. I quote, "Because of the masses' eagerness to practice magic, the temple scribes inscribed the names of the herbs and other things which they employed on the statues of the gods, so that the masses, as a consequence of their misunderstanding, might not practice magic. But we have collected the explanations of these names from many copies of the sacred writings, all of them secret. Here they are. A snake's head, a leech. Blood of a snake, hematite. Lion semen, human semen. Semen of Hermes, dill. Blood from a head, lupine. Blood of Hephaestus, artemisia. Human bile, turnip sap. Fat from a head, spurge. But note, blood of porcupine, really from the porcupine." Campbell Thompson also realized in his introduction to his Dictionary of Assyrian Chemistry and Geology that the Assyrian was ready to call what was almost certainly opium, which is a nice painting of the poppy here, but not from Mesopotamia, by name of lion fat or human fat, or castor oil, as the blood of a black snake. Other plant names are less fanciful, even though they may betray wishful thinking.
Hello SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded, and I'll be posting this video again as a standalone. The previous video I posted, been working on a series, and although these topics are related, they don't quite make it in, and this book will be on the Voynich Manuscript. Is very often spoken about, mysterious manuscript. The vellum on which it has written has been dated to be at least 500 years old, and so that'll be the focus of this video. So you can see some of the images now. Okay, I'll take you through the book first, but I'll link these videos in the description because I've been looking at ancient medicine, how that relates to the alchemists, especially apothecary, the pharmacy, medicine aspect of alchemists. And I'll link the Erika Reiner lecture where she talks about how ancient terms would often be very exotic, but they are actually blood of a head, for instance, is lupine, which is one of these plants which have been identified in the Voynich manuscript, and I'll be explaining that in a moment. But again, we see castor oil, very ancient, popular back to ancient Egypt, ancient times, and still up until now. And this has also been one of the suspected plants in the Voynich manuscript. The Voynich manuscript is pretty much a medical book, and I'll explain that in a moment. But Johnson papyrus, Greek, but found in Egypt near Thebes, about 400 BC, and appears to show comfrey, another very ancient, very popular medicinal herb, and that's also been suggested to be one of the plants identified in the Voynich manuscript, along with poppy, which was referred to as lion fat or human fat in ancient times. I'll link the homepage to Edith Sherwood. While I was working on this, I was referring to her quite often, and she speaks about some ideas and identifying plants from the Voynich manuscript. Also about possible other authorship, including Leonardo da Vinci. Now, it's only in the last few weeks I was looking at that, and here are some of the screenshots on her botanical identifications of plants in the Voynich manuscript, such as mandrake root, poppy, and others. Now, just in the last few days, these have all gone. So her homepage is still there, but the references are not. However, there are other sites which recorded this and some other interpretations on plant identification from the Voynich manuscript which refer to Edith Sherwood. And also curious mention would be the connections, because many of the plants are very Voynich Manuscript European, but many of those plants are not European. And there's some suggestion that there is an American connection. I'll also link this channel, which has been looking at trying to decode, understand what's happening in the Voynich manuscript. And we'll go through that whole in a moment. But the overwhelming majority of the Voynich manuscript looks like this. Small amount of writing and plant illustrations. This is well over 60% of the text in itself. There are a small proportion, I'd say maybe 10% of the book has astronomical illustrations, such as these. They are probably not the best choice, but they're very clearly astronomical connections. They're also, again, probably about 10 to 20 pages. We'll go through the manuscript in a moment, which have illustrations such as these, which appear to be anatomical. For instance, you can see the intestines there, or what appears to be. And also towards the end of the illustrated part of a book, we have, which I'll show you in a better, but for instance, they have pictures of plants then listed next to these jars, vessels, containers of these plants. So again, I'll link some of the work of Erika Reiner, one of her books and one of her lectures, where she talks about these ancient texts and the medicinal texts especially, such as a Johnson papyrus, but her speciality is Akkadian and Babylonian. And she speaks about that. Now, in that lecture, she'll also speak, and for instance, the Leiden papyrus, again found near Thebes, written in Greek, probably around about the 4th century AD. Ancient Babylonian medicinal texts, and even Paracelsus and these alchemists in medicine trade would often include astrology, or that a certain plant must be picked at a certain time of year, prepared in a certain way according to phases of the moon, or given to the patient at a certain time of the year based on the planet's sun and moon and etc. Laid out quite clearly in ancient, even the more modern Hermetic period. So there's a connection between the herbs, medicine, anatomy, and astronomy. And for instance, this is let's just call it medieval for the moment, anatomical text. So the way the organs are arranged. You can also see how the figures are related inside the organs. And this again, stylistically, and now we can read these. This is a known language. No one's cracked the Voynich text as yet, but we see strong connections visually as well. Plus we have all those jars, and I'll examine that again a little towards the end of the video. But again, older depictions of the pharmacist or the apothecary having these different types of jars to store different types of plants and powders, even metals, herbs, oils, etc. Would be stored in a different way. And these, again, from the Voynich, do very closely match that. I'll also be looking at direct connections from the Voynich manuscript to Athanasius, Kircher, and especially to other very important, well-known Jesuits and lesser-known alchemists, Jesuits, such as George Baresh. So now I want to now just flick through the entirety of the Voynich manuscript so we can see what it is rather than just a handful of pages. This is from an online source of the entirety of the surviving Voynich manuscript. That link will be in the description. I'm just going to flick through it quickly. Again, link in the description. You can go through it page by page, and but it's 209 pages in total, and plants, and this. Okay, I should have made sure it was all loaded. But what we're just going to see is, as you skip through, page after page of illustrations of plants. and suspicion of those which have been identified or very almost certainly identified, as well as other unknown plants. But this is the overwhelming bulk of the Voynich manuscript. Now, even such as De Materia Medica, this ancient herbal text, illustrated one going back to early 1st century, so we have even the surviving ones from 4th, 5th centuries. Cannabis sativa, which has been a very popular plant, and it matches the older, more stylized illustrations, as where the later versions of De Materia Medica by Dioscorides, they get more and more accurate in their depictions. But just the Voynich manuscript, we're up to page 36 of 200, and you can see it's just page after page of plants, and again many of them are very closely, almost certainly, herbs with medicinal values. Back in the day, a herbal medicinal garden was like everyone would have a herbal garden at their, in their land or close to them. This was just the way things worked. Page 56, and on it goes. Link will be in the description if you want to go through it more detailed. Just don't want to wait for every page to fully load up, just so that you know and you can see what I'm getting at here. It's a plant botanical book. Overwhelming majority of it. Up to page 78, 80. So the script of the Voynich, okay, this is, most believe is to be Mandrake, Mandragora, very important back again in ancient times. There's a lot of stuff connected to that. I just posted a video a few days ago on various legends and aspects of Mandrake. So we're at page 100, we're over halfway, and it's just page after page of plant and plant. More plants. Page 110 of 210, 112. Okay, now we hit the first astronomical imagery. Straight back to plants. More plants, and now plants. Now we'll start to see some more easily identifiable astronomical imagery, even if over the writing hasn't been. We see, of course, sun and moon, etc. More, so it was about page 118 that we had the first astronomical images. Page 126, 128, 130, 132, and now we enter a new part. So the more than the first 50% purely plants, small section, roughly 25 pages on astronomical images, and now we start to see this type of imagery. And these, well, ladies bathing, but if you take, these appear to be anatomical. They do match of the period that the vellum, that the paper that it was written on appears, does match those anatomical illustrations from around about that time, and sort of matches the philosophy in regards to how fluids and blood, etc., was transmitted around the body and what it actually did. Again, more of these seemingly... now, there's also nice connections to some alchemical processes that could be derived from here, but to my thinking it's much more anatomical. Okay, back to some more. Okay, now we're back to maps and astronomy again, connected to now more herbals. Now we see the first of these vessels. So we see plants listed by the side, connected to a certain type of jar or a container or vase, vessel. And again, a jar, plants linked to them, more varying jars, and this matches the old apothecary of different plants. Materials would be stored in a different material container, but also different shapes and colors as well. More plants. It's a herbal book, Voynich. More plants. Okay, now we start to see again plants listed next to a different type of jar. Again, same thing. Again, more of these jars connected to a particular type of plant. More and more jars. So there's more of that section than there is on astronomy now. From page 181, 182 to the end, now it's pure text. So you can, it's been divided up into like 6 groups, but essentially there's 4 groups. There's the plants, then there's astronomy, then there's anatomy, let's call it. It's much closer to anatomy than anything else in my mind. Then there's the plants connected to jars, bottles, etc. And then we have these last pages, which are all text. There's suspected to be about 20 pages missing from there. But yes, this is the Voynich Manuscript and what it contains. The language has not been deciphered, at least not publicly. And so there we can see what it is. So before I now go on to the next section and look at these other links, just so that if you've heard of a Voynich manuscript, you can go through, links in the description. But this is what the actual entirety of that mysterious manuscript is. So as we just saw, the majority of the manuscript, Voynich manuscript, is plants. A smaller section related to astronomy with a couple of maps there. A small section again which seems to relate to anatomy at the time, and then a section which has plants listed next to various containers and jars. And again, the similarity between ancient medicinal texts such as the Johnston Papyrus, the concept of astronomy / astrology and how it relates to the picking of herbs, application of medicines, the ideas on anatomy at the time, and apothecary jars. And so now I want to have a look at the connection to Athanasius Kircher and the Voynich manuscript. But firstly, okay, I'll link this playlist. The first of them, I'll go through other illustrations by Kircher and the quadrivium, Hermeticism, astronomy, music, arithmetic and geometry being the basis for all of these famous images related to the alchemists, Hermeticists at the time, or just the undeniable basis of it. Now even in this you'll notice, well, music, geometry and astronomy, and geometry and arithmetic, sorry, as well as astronomy being based in there. We also have these 2 pillars. There could be something said about those, but what's also embedded in this picture, well, so if you look at alchemy, so the applications of that would be for dyes, paints and pigments. Very, like, we take that for granted, the accessibility of colors at the time. If you, for instance, in ancient times could afford purple, you were very, very rich. Alchemy also applies to metalwork. For instance, in a cathedral, the paint, the metalwork in there, and also the stained glass. These are all applications to which the alchemists had ever so important. You can't build this without chemistry, or as it was called then, alchemy. But even the vessels and the tools of alchemy, the metal and the glass, is also an essential element in the alchemist trade. In Old English, Spagyric was I believe it was a general term for alchemy, and it's come to mean alchemy related especially to medicine. So you have the 7 steps of the alchemist craft, which includes tincture, calcination, solution, coagulation, etc. Well, the application of those to herbs, especially to create medicines. And you might even notice these lovely types of bottles, how they will relate to this trade as well. So Kircher's image, but firstly apothecary, or the chemist as we would call it here in Australia, England as well, or pharmacy would be the more common term in America for where you go to get your medicines. This standard symbol with the cup and the snake, or the mortar and pestle, to grind up the powders and the herbs, etc. These are since age old, these have been the symbols of the chemist or the alchemist or pharmacy or apothecary, depending on what part of the world you're in. But this standard symbol, the cup and the snake, see some variations again on this very, very old symbol. It's a symbol of medicine and of doctors. So the rod of Asclepius, one snake about the rod, that's still often used by paramedics. Sometimes you'll see the double snake, but the rod of Asclepius, or the cup of Hygeia. That's what this pharmacy symbol is. We have the cup of Hygeia and the snake, the rod of Asclepius. Now, even in imagery of Hygeia, you'll see the snake as well. Well, Hygeia, where we get the word hygiene, was I'm not quite sure if you'd call it a goddess, but she was related to the society of doctors back in ancient Greece. And Asclepius, the son of Apollo, was the Greek god of healing and medicines. So this Greco-Roman pagan origins for these symbols still with us. And if we zoom in on this part of the picture, well, what do we see here? The rod of Asclepius, the snake, and the cup of Hygeia with the snake again. So apothecary, pharmacy imagery built into this by Kircher as well. Now, IHS, or the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, I'll mention that more on that in a moment. I'll do a little detour in regards to that. IHS, that's the symbol of the Jesuits. Now, the first confirmed owner of the Voynich Manuscript was a fellow by the name of George Baresh. There's also an alternative spelling, but when he signed his letters, he signed them Baresh. 1585 to 1662, an antique dealer and an alchemist, and he studied at the Jesuit College of Clementine in Prague, which was, I think, the second or third most important Jesuit college at that time. First confirmed owner of the Voynich Manuscript. This is a letter that he sent to Athanasius Kircher, asking for help in trying to decode it. You can see he signed it Baresh. So there are alternative spellings to his name, but that's how he signed his. I'll put links again to these, the original letters where you can find them, also the translations of them as well. Those links too will be in the description. Now I just took the major parts of this letter from George, so Bartius is how he's sometimes called, but Baresh as well. So his letter in 1639 to Athanasius Kircher. George Baresh wrote the letter. He sent the letter to Kircher via Theodore Meritus, who was on his way from Prague to Rome, and that's how the letter via George Meritus got there. Now, in the opening of his letter, Reverend Father Meritus, priest of the Society of Jesus. Meritus too was a Jesuit, but he was also a mathematician, an astronomer. He did some work on physics. He was looking into magnetism. There's a Meritus crater on the moon. He published and suggested that magnetism was the cause of the tides, for instance, but mathematics, astronomy, physics, science in general, wrote a letter to Kircher. He was a mathematician, scholar in general, and that letter was from the original owner asking for help in the translation. Now, Meritus, very important, a mathematician, geometer, theologian, and philosopher, trained in, and there's the Meritus crater. Now, he wrote several books. Most of them were on theology, but he also did work related to maths, but also looked into alchemy. These guys didn't have a specialization. Okay. Now, he was also, so whether it was Kircher, Fludd, or these other people, they're all in geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, and music, because Meritus was also promoting the concept of Pythagorean music as well in some of his math work. The Plantin Meritus Museum in Antwerp. Big thank you to Ninth Heretic. She visited and shared these photos. Now, what's important is that Meritus was a from a family of printers, which would have given him very privileged access to the books being printed at the time. Can't be underestimated how important the printing press was in the history of the world, especially in the last half millennia or so, and also in the transmission of these. So ancient or older cathedrals, ancient places such as the Library of Alexandria, everything had to be handwritten. Books were very, very expensive. Even the development of paper, instead of using parchment or vellum or these other more difficult to produce media to do your printing and your writing, but the printing press can't be underestimated. And this was one of the reasons why books such as the Hermetica, but really what's more important is like the 10 books of architecture by Vitruvius, De Materia Medica, the books of Hieron, Plato, etc. They were able to be printed and distributed in a open to the world. So even, for instance, the Bible. Previously, they were all illuminated, handwritten scripts. Now with a printing press, instead of being a very rare book you would have to travel to read, every church, and soon enough almost every household would have access to the Bible, but also these other ancient texts. Renaissance, the rebirth, was where classical texts were rebirthed and become popular. You didn't have to travel hundreds of miles to a cathedral or to the library of a very rich king or a lord to be able to look at these books. But Meritus, access to a printing press, he would have been able to read these books, which were suddenly now becoming available. Here's some of the typeset facing. So the printing press, basically, Germans, Dutch, Belgium, so the German-speaking or German-related languages was the main production point for printing presses and how they moved around to especially the rest of Europe. You can see these the typesetting here, which is an important feature because the modern English alphabet and language, but the alphabet has been shaped by the German printing press. There used to be a letter called Forn, so TH as in vo, I'm going to ver, or vo, all those TH words. TH now is 2 letters, okay, but there used to be a letter called Forn, a single letter, which incorporated that. We lost that because of the way that the Germans speak. They can't pronounce it, so we lost Forn. And I'll show you an example of that, but a bit of a detour. Early works, okay, King James Bible, Majesty is with an I. Jesus is with an I. Judah begins with an I and a V. The old, for instance, the King James Bible, the spelling at that time was quite different, and this would apply very strongly to any study of modern English. Now, ye old, it's actually ye, or the Y, is a evolution of the word of the letter Forn, TH. If in ye old times, I would actually say the old, not ye old. And this would relate to, Yah, as Nordic people would say, but even in like Southern Europe, in the Balkans, for instance, J is written J, but it's pronounced with the Y sound, that, Yah or Yah. And again, letters such as I replaced Jesus. So this would have an application for, this is one of my concerns with modern gematria of modern English. It's not really incorporating these factors. We also have, for instance, Samuel Johnson, but the second American. So he wrote the first English dictionary. He received a second American edition. And how different words in different English, there are multiple Englishes. And I think there's a bit of a tendency to be a bit, especially American English narcissism, let's call it, and then not looking at these other, the development of English, not only over time, but even now, how they're a separate group. So there are many forms of English across the world. Most of the world doesn't speak English. So in the modern languages, which have now been separated from the numbers, my question would be, well, what about German gematria? What about French gematria? What about Spanish or every other language? So why does English stand out as being so special, and why, given the development of the English language and its even just from World War One to World War Two, you can get old dictionaries and you look at the differences in spelling. It's changed. Words are changing quite a lot. And so, firstly, why English, but also that English has been shaped and changed by German printing presses, for instance. So I can't say I've studied it in depth at Gematria, but these would be my questions. I don't know how to resolve these issues to find any code in modern English, especially given the different regional variations and variations over time, and again, printing press influences. So I'll link this video in there as well. There's multiple videos on this in regards to how Thorn, this letter was lost from the language, which would change, with 26 letters is not the standard. It is a relatively modern variation on there, and I'll link that as well. But okay, and I'm just going to include a small little bit of video just to illustrate the point how the German speaking has influenced the printing press, which influenced the English language. I'll also drop there's a great video that was just recently published in regards to the origin Indo-European and words such as pater or father in Greek and Roman become father with an F in German because they always soften their sounds. Or also how discos become disc or desk, but while in German, because of their pronunciation, it become dish. And so dish to eat originates from discos, and that has again to do with the influence of these other languages into modern English.
Mayday, mayday. Hello, can you hear us? Can you hear us? Can you... Over. We are sinking. We are sinking.
Hello? This is the German Coast Guard.
We are sinking. We're sinking.
What are you thinking about?
So, Fawn, we are sinking. What are you thinking? Okay, so that's how things have been changed by the printing press and so many other aspects in regards to English. So back to earliest confirmed owner of a Voynich manuscript, George Baresh, via Theodore Meritus, sent this letter to Kircher asking for help in there. Meritus, okay, also from Geometry, that's the Plantin Meritus Museum, also on the inside, well, Geometry and Hermes with the caduceus there. We even got the traveller's hat with a little feather in his cap as well. The reason why Baresh sent the letter asking for help on the Voynich manuscript was to Kircher was because just recently he had published a book on the Coptic alphabet, and as he says, Your Reverence won worldwide acclaim by publishing the Prodromus Copticus. Short in 1643, Kircher published another book in regards to the Egyptian language, drawing a connection between Coptic and Egyptian hieroglyphs. This was 2 centuries before the Rosetta Stone, and it's interesting because another one. Okay, he has also informed me of your unheard of skill in untying the riddles of some very obscure scripts. Now, since there is in my library uselessly taking up space a certain riddle of the Sphinx, a piece of writing in unknown characters, I thought it would not be out of place to send the puzzle to the Oedipus of Egypt to be solved. So even at that time, Kircher was famous for his knowledge of Egypt and the ancient world. Oedipus of Egypt, or Oedipus and the riddle of the Sphinx, is an old image from Greece with a Sphinx upon especially I thought that's relevant because it's an Ionic column. Kircher also published on Ionian, Dorian and music scales as well. So mathematicians, musicians, astronomers and arithmetic just being at the very heart of this all. Now the riddle of the Sphinx, Oedipus had to pass the Sphinx, and if he couldn't answer the riddle, he would die. He answered the riddle. The riddle was, what walks on 4 legs, then 2, then 3? He said, well, a man. You're born and you crawl on 4 legs, you walk on 2 legs, and in your old age you need a cane, so your 3rd leg. The oldest, what they Temple of Apollo at Delphi, the Naxian Sphinx as it's called. We see this early development of the Ionic column there as well, which is also important in Freemasonry as well. There are 3 pillars. The central pillar is usually the Ionic column, or the column of wisdom, related to the woman, and Greek sphinxes tend to be feminine. Kircher, the Oedipus of Egypt, also sold Oedipus Egypt, so the riddle of Egypt, which include all sorts of imagery and examinations of ancient Egyptian gods, goddesses, etc. And so Baresh, and then he writes what he believes the Voynich Manuscript to be. From the pictures of herbs, which there are a great many in the Codex, and of varied images, stars and other things, bearing the appearance of chemical symbolism. It is my guess that the whole thing is medical. He's speaking of a Voynich Manuscript to Kircher, the most beneficial branch of learning for the human race, apart from the salvation of souls. This task is not beneath the dignity of a powerful intellect. After all, this thing cannot be for the masses, as may be judged from the precautions of the author took in order to keep the uneducated ignorant of it. In fact, it is easily conceivable that some man of quality went to Oriental parts in quest of true medicine. He would have grasped that popular medicine here in Europe is of little value. He would have acquired the treasures of Egyptian medicine, partly from the written literature, but also from associating with the experts in the art, brought them back with him, and buried them in his book in the same script. This is all the more plausible because the volume contains pictures of exotic plants which have escaped observation here in Germany. So Baresh, looking at its herbal books such as De Materia Medica, available at that time, connected to so the Voynich Manuscript, essentially a book on medicine, and that does bear it out. So Johnson Papyrus, and then connections to the Voynich, similarities I mentioned earlier. So people are suggesting that some of these plants in the Voynich Manuscript actually come not just from the east, but from the west, from America, the Americas, which is interesting because, for instance, Rosslyn Chapel, there are carvings of plants in Rosslyn Chapel that are American, or appear to be, because they don't match any known plants of East or of the Far East or of Europe, and that they were almost certainly carved 50 years before Columbus travelled to America. Now, St. Brendan is believed to have travelled to Americas. Of course, the Vikings, the Norse people, travelled to the Americas as well. And I'll link this video, Lapis Elixis, Lost Secrets of the Illuminati. It's a bit of a title's a bit out there, but he looks into, very interesting video anyway, but when he visits Rosslyn Chapel, there are 3 other plants that not only appear to be from the Americas, they appear to be medicinal plants that were used by the native North Americans, which come from the Rocky Mountains, quite some distance from the east coast of America. So possible connections across the Atlantic going back quite some time, medicinal plants especially. Now, Kircher's reply to Meritus, as for the book filled with some sort of I'll link this in the description where I got the reply from. The person who published that, again, their Latin is not, they're not an expert in Latin. So, but if you drop that same text into online Latin translators, it's pretty much spot on. But tiny little details are irrelevant, really. As for the book filled with some sort of, Mrs. Kircher's reply via Meritus back to George Baresh, as for the book filled with some sort of mysterious stenography which you enclosed with your letter, I have looked at it and concluded that it requires application rather than insight in its solver. I can recall solving many writings of this kind when the occasion presented itself, and the itch of my mind working would have tried out some ideas on it, if only many very urgent tasks did not call me away from unsuitable work of this kind. However, When I have more free time and can take advantage of a more suitable moment, I expect I shall try to solve it when the mood and inspiration take me. Finally, I can let you know that the other sheet, which appeared to be written in the same unknown script, is printed in the Illyrian language, in the script commonly called St. Jerome's, and they use the same script here in Rome to write missals, or when they have a mass, they write down the mass, a missal, and other holy books in the Illyrian language. Illyria, the tribes of Illyria were what most people would refer to as the former Yugoslavia and Albania. The actual Illyrian language is much more mysterious exactly what it is in St. Jerome. So that some people would say, who are more familiar with surviving Illyrian letters, etc., would probably argue that point, but that was what Kircher said on what is the script in the Voynich Manuscript. Because this letter from Kircher back to Baresh went via Meretus being a mathematician into physics, astronomy, etc., they began a long conversation on magnetism. Both of them published books in regards to magnetism. They also started an ongoing exchange in regards on measurement, and especially in regards to what is the foot, which I find interesting because Hermes, Mercurius, Trismegistus, both gods of science, gods of weights and measure, which is ever in alchemy, geometry, astronomy, whatever. Without weights and measure, no science. So George Baresh, first confirmed owner via Jesuit links to Kircher on the Voynich Manuscript, which and it's pretty evident it's a herbal book for the most part. Now, Apothecary, we saw even the imagery of Kircher with a cup of Hygeia and the rod of Asclepius, being these images of pharmacy, chemistry, medicine, or apothecary as it's called. So you see old medieval images of it, and other apothecary museums where we see these different types of jars and bottles, how they would store the various medicines. So you can just get a close-up, different types and shapes of jars. Now, for instance, if you still, at least here in Australia, when you buy a bottle of methylated spirits or mineral turpentine, the bottles, plastic bottles, will have these lines on them so that you can feel that it's poison. In the old days, these glass bottles of poison, would either have the skull and crossbones on them, big poison written, or just have lines going up and down, so that in the especially candlelit days, if you went and reached for a bottle, you wouldn't accidentally, grab the arsenic instead of the rum. And you could feel, that it was poisonous. Get some other examples of now. Clear glass back in the day was much more expensive than coloured glass as well. That's another point. So these are again examples of poisonous bottles, as where bottles of scents and colognes would have different shapes and different cross-hatching, etc. So you could feel what was inside of them, rather than having to see it. Even the old-fashioned candy store with their jars, apothecary, drug store, like in America, you see those old movies where you go to the drugstore to go get a milkshake or buy your candy, etc. as well. Again, different shapes and styles of bottles for different containers, which brings us back to the Voynich Manuscript, where we have these pages. So this particular container, you see plants listed by each one of those. Again, and same thing happening. One of the major parts of a Voynich Manuscript is, of course, these jars, containers being linked to a certain type of plant, medicine. So there's just I've cropped all the varying types that are shown there. Apothecary, again, different shaped bottles relating to different medicines. This being a very old practice. And the alchemy of glass making. So alchemy would also include making colours, but also how to colour glass. Now, just like a glaze on a ceramic, it might go on whitish, but when you bring it out of a kiln, it'll be a brilliant blue, etc. So this is another of the secret aspect of the alchemy and the secrets of glass making, and that's sort of one of the focuses I want to do in these actual upcoming videos, but I just wanted to do a diversion and look at the Voynich Manuscript because of the connection between the jars and, for instance, Murano glass, the Venetian glass, where they made the first truly clear glass, which allowed them also to make mirrors. The glass trade was so valuable and so secret that they were actually separated on an island of Moran Island, the Murano Island glass, and that's just another aspect of the alchemists' trade. But of course, glass making, metal work would also be necessary in the making of tools, and those colours, metalwork, dyes, pigments, etc. It's secret knowledge, trade secrets, very valuable. But also, of course, this would have military applications because, as Paracelsus says, there is no such thing as a poison, there is only poisonous dosages. And so what can be beneficial in a small dose can be very harmful in a large dose. Okay, so the Voynich Manuscript, it's almost certainly a book on medicines, and although apothecary or Spagyric as it's also known. We see the different jars, we see the different plants, and of course those bottles related therein. The very interesting period, especially around people like Athanasius Kircher. It all, there's a handful of very important figures, and all these mysterious groups and developments and publications, and whether it's art, architecture, military technology, chemistry, theology, the development seems to orbit a very small group of people. And this was also, as I mentioned, in regards to the printing press. Once the printing press was there, these type of books could be widely distributed. Are still kept secret though, even I mentioned in some earlier videos, and I want to do that in the next few, show how the ancient text and the colourful language that was used to encode secret knowledge and keep it secret. Okay, so this was anyway, SGD, hope you enjoyed.